Was Faulkner a very biblical man? And I mean, this title's got to be intentional, correct?
Absolutely, including the exclamation point at the end of it. Absalom, comma, Absalom, exclamation point. And we know that Absalom was the bad son, right? And he's the one who rebelled against his father and finally is killed because his beautiful hair gets tangled in the limbs of a tree.
Welcome back to the Big Book Project. I'm your host, Lori Feathers, and we are just starting this week our collective read of William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. And joining me today is Dr. Larry Allums, and he's, I think, an expert on Faulkner, although he might dispute that. But I'm really happy, Larry, that you're joining us today to talk about this amazing book. We're going to talk about the first 3 chapters today.
Wonderful. Good. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Um, Maybe we'll start with just a little bit about your personal history with the book. When did you first read Absalom, Absalom? And was it the first Faulkner that you were introduced to?
It was not the first Faulkner I was introduced to, um, and I read it. I read it for the first time, and it didn't affect me the way it did the next time I read it, which is when I started graduate school in the mid 70s and went to a lecture during which Dr. Louise Cowan, professor at UD, professor at University of Dallas, read a portion of it, and I was hooked. So immediately after that, I went and read it again, and then over the succeeding years, I've probably read it 6 or 8 other times.
Yeah. Um, it's quite the book, and it does, I think, benefit from a rereading. But we're going to have a lot of people, I think, listening to this that are coming to the book for the first time. And it can be a bit confounding and confusing at first. We've got more than one narrator. The uh, the story is nonlinear. It's based a lot on people's memories, and sometimes it's memories of things that happened quite a long time ago. So, do you have any kind of I don't know, tips or advice for readers as they're kind of perhaps entering this world of Faulkner for the first time?
Yeah, a few, I think. And Faulkner has actually helped us I mean, he was very much aware of the complexity of this novel. And so he did a lot of things before it was published to help himself out. And then it ended up that he published them and they helped the reader out too. And so they're all in the back of the novel, and in most editions. And this, I'm using the Vintage International Edition. And so there is a chronology, which is very helpful. There is a description of all the major characters and some minor characters. And then, and this was a wonderful thing that Faulkner did for himself, and this was published in 1936. And so he had already published several novels since his first big one, The Sound and the Fury, in 1929. But with this one, because it was so complex and he had to dive into it in such a particular way, he made a map. And we've probably anyone interested in this map probably has seen it. But he made it when he was writing this novel. It was of Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, his fictional county. And I mean, he was very particular about it. He outlined places and names and all kinds of things. And so I would say my first bit of advice for the first time reader is put a little marker back in the back of your book. And anytime you have a question, go over there and see if something over there in the end matter answers your question. Now, that's not going to answer all of them. So I think that if there is ever a novel uh, uh, on reading which you ought to take Samuel Taylor Coleridge's advice of willing suspension of disbelief, I think this is the novel, because it is very difficult. And Faulkner had tried this technique before, but nothing like this, that is withholding information, right? And he's sort of partially revealing things, and then as you go along, he reveals little by little until at the end, all of it is revealed. And in this novel, I mean, it is the last page in which it is all revealed. And so, but in the meantime, we go through, and this is very important for Faulkner always, we go through several narrators. And I know that your readers, if they're like the readers of my book group, they are attentive to the narrators and whether the narrator is a good source of information or an omniscient narrator, whatever it is. But then there are four in this one. And, and they, there's an omniscient narrator, and often we wish that he was, or it was, more present than it is. But also, Miss Rosa Coldfield is there as a narrator. We'll get to know her in just a few minutes. And then Mr. Compson, Quentin Compson's father, as they sit on the front porch in 1909 before he's getting ready to go off to Harvard, right? And so if anybody has read Sound and the Fury, that resonates with that novel because we know what happens to Quentin in that novel uh, in 1910, at the end of his freshman year. So here, though, he's sort of the receiver like we are. He's taking all this information in, but he knows a lot more about it than we do already. Okay, so I would say another bit of advice that might be helpful is, keep yourself as open as you can, and anytime you have a question, just say to yourself, well, I have faith that it will be resolved at some point in the future. So,
Well, I think maybe for me at least, the first question comes from the title. And it is, as I understand it, a biblical reference
mhm.
from the book of Second Samuel. And it refers to King David's and his three children, and kind of God's promise to them or covenant to them and to the Israelites. And I've I've read some commentary about how perhaps that title is a little twisted here because there's a very sinister tone, especially when we are listening to Rosa Coldfield, um, who's now elderly, kind of telling this tale of her younger years about God forsaking the South during the Civil War. And I feel like she kind of feels like God forsook them as well by allowing this devil man, Thomas Sutpen, to come into their midst in 1833. So was Faulkner a very biblical man? And I mean, this title's got to be intentional, correct?
Absolutely, including the exclamation point at the end of it. Absalom, comma, Absalom, exclamation point. And we know that Absalom was the bad son, right? And he's the one who rebelled against his father and finally is killed because his beautiful hair gets tangled in the limbs of a tree. And Faulkner was very biblical. I mean, he loved the Old Testament especially and knew it. And as a matter of fact, one of his most controversial works, called A Fable, is based on the whole incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. It's hard to read, but Faulkner was very biblical. As a matter of fact, I could expand that a little bit and say that Faulkner had a mythic imagination. And so he's got the Greeks in his imagination, he's got the Romans in his imagination, and the Hebrews. And so he just pulls on those things almost at will sometime. and you can see the way they animate his story. And in these first three chapters that we've got today, we see references to the tragedies of the Greeks, Aeschylus and even Sophocles. So that's another thing to keep in mind as we go. And if we need to, let's go to Google and read that, remind ourselves of who Absalom is, or who Clytemnestra is, or Cassandra, and that kind of thing.
Right. So I feel like a lot of people coming to the book for the first time might be a little frustrated because our first narrator here, the elderly Rosa Coldfield, is, um, I would say, her narration of events is even a little bit more confusing than Mr. Compson's in chapters 2 and 3. So, um, I don't know. Is there a reason in your mind why uh, Faulkner chooses her to be our first narrator?
Um, I, I don't know that there's a definitive answer to that question, but you can see what motivates her as we read that first chapter. And it is, what would you say? What's the right word? Pure rage, pure embitterment, all those things that have just wrenched her around. And, this is 1909. She was born in 1845, and she was actually born into the middle of the drama that Sutpen had already started in the town of Jefferson. So she's kind of trying to do it the whole time to catch up. But we do learn in sort of bits and pieces exactly why she is so outraged, and it has to do with the and well, I'll go ahead and say it. It's hard to know what you say is going to reveal something that you don't need to be revealing, or what. But that's the nature of a detective story, which this is in large measure, figuring out what has happened. But it turns out that the basis of her rage is not only what Sutpen has exacted upon her family. Her father, Mr. Coldfield, and her sister Ellen, who marries Sutpen, and her two, um, what would they be? Her nieces and nephews, also, although they're younger than she is, you know. So I mean, although she's younger than they are, so it's a sort of a strange thing. Actually, Sutpen, is it too nice a word to say that he proposed to her?
Uh, yeah, you mean to Rosa?
Yeah, to Rosa.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but they don't ever end up consummating that marriage, correct?
they don't ever get married at all. Right,
Yeah.
exactly right. Yeah, because there's an outrage that's associated with it that we learn as we go. And chapter 5 of this, which is all in italics, long chapter, all in italics, where Rosa is also the narrator. And Faulkner pretty much drove his publishers crazy with this book. And so there was a lot of back and forth, more than the normal stuff, about asking what this means, or can we do this, to Faulkner. And one of the things they asked him was, can we just make chapter 5 all Roman type and get rid of those italics? He wrote back, telegram, one word, capital N, capital O.
Was there an exclamation point after the
Yes,
no?
yes, yes. I think so.
Um, I want to talk a little bit. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about any of the characters other than Thomas Sutpen in this because I think that he's such a fascinating character and he's painted in such sinister tones. Like the book is so atmospheric about how this devil just rode into town from out of nowhere one
Mm,
day.
mm,
And he bought up some land and left again and came back with some Negroes and this strange architect from Martinique. But I think that the character of Mr. Coldfield is a very important character. This is Rosa and Ellen's father because he's kind of he almost feels like a foil for Sutpen or an opposite of Sutpen in terms of his moral integrity. And he gets involved with Sutpen in a I guess it's a little murky so far, but in some kind of commercial transaction. And it goes south, or he wants to pull out of it once he understands it, and he ends up losing money from it. Um, and maybe you could talk a little bit about Mr. Coldfield and then also this remarkable thing that he does during the Civil War.
Yes, yeah, right. Well, it's hard to understand Mr. Coldfield. We do know that he's a really a Puritan minded man. He's not a Puritan, but he's a Christian, and he is known for his moral integrity, and that's all that seems to matter to him, And so when Sutpen approaches him, it is for a particular reason, and it is to ask permission to court Mr. Coldfield's daughter, Ellen. We don't know why yet he wants to court Ellen and marry her, what the basis of his choice is or not. But for some reason, it always remains a bit mysterious. Mr. Coldfield agrees to it. Um, we really don't know why. But as you were pointing out, and we don't really even know this, actually, the reader is a good bit in the position of the townspeople of Jefferson in this first chapter. We just have to watch the comings and goings of Thomas Sutpen, and also into chapter 2, and just try to figure out what it is that he's up to. But for some reason, Mr. Coldfield agrees to go along with it, and even goes so far as you're indicating to help him with what comes to be known as his design, his plan. That to build this incredible house. We'll talk about this incredible house in just a minute. But and it is only up to a certain point when he mistrusts what Sutpen is doing that he pulls out of everything, and as you say, loses money. He doesn't have any money to lose. He's just got this little country store, and it just barely gets them by. And his sister lives with them, so Rosa's aunt lives with them, and then Rosa, and that's it. After Ellen leaves, after she marries Sutpen. So now, as for what he does during the Civil War, um, well, he long story short, when the war starts, he goes to his attic, nails himself up in there, shuts himself up in the attic, and doesn't come down again as long as the war is going on until he dies in 1864. That is to say, most of the war. And Rosa, the dutiful daughter who doesn't understand it, Rosa hoists up by this little mechanism food to him every day. And so when one day she loads the tray and it's not hoisted, then she begins to suspect something's wrong. 3 days later, they find him up there dead with that food that he has not eaten. So he has starved himself to death out of objections, we assume, against the war. So
Yeah.
he's just totally against the war. Meanwhile, Rosa, and she was born in 1845, and so she's almost 20 years old during this time when he's up in the attic, right? She's meanwhile writing insipid poetry about the brave heroes of the Confederacy, and she's got 1,000 of them that they find later. And so there's that dichotomy between what she's thinking about the South and what her father is thinking about the South. But that's pretty much who he is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I can't remember whether this is Rosa or Mr. Compson that makes it pretty clear. that Thomas Sutpen no doubt targeted Ellen because um, like you said, the Coldfields don't have money, but Sutpen wanted some respectability in the
Yes.
community, and this Mr. Coldfield is just a morally uh, righteous person. And so the fact that he would give his daughter to Sutpen, I think, kind of perhaps Sutpen thought would give him a level of prestige that he really couldn't get, and would also negate any of the chattering that might be going on that he was trying to um, find a partner for pecuniary benefit.
Yeah. Yes, exactly right. And so the word that Mr. Compson uses when he's describing that is moral approbation, because um, I'm a Southerner, so I understand this. I think you do too, that who you are depends on where you come from and who your people are if you're a Southerner. Now, that's a very big deal. And so when Sutpen shows up in 1833 on his horse, with that wonderful image of him there with his hand palm uplifted, as in the olden times, be light. So there's Faulkner with the Bible again. Let there be light. So Sutpen is described as someone who has that kind of agency. He just comes in unannounced, unknown, and does what he does. And so nobody in the South is going to give him any credence at all, no approval, unless he can anchor himself to somebody who has a lot of moral integrity, and that's Mr. Coldfield, probably above all the people. And you're right, Mr. Coldfield says that's why he chose him. That's why he picked him out. That's
Yeah.
why, actually, I should say, why he did have the one necessary thing, right, which was the daughter. And that word that you use is very key here as we go through, and that's respectability. Respectability, that he's got to have respectability. He can't get it directly, and so he's got to get it by association with Mr. Coldfield in order to make his start and to make do in that community what he wants to do.
Well, this is probably a good time to talk about Sutpen's arrival in Jefferson,
Mhm.
his creation of Sutpen's Hundreds outside of the town of Jefferson, and this extraordinary way that this land and this house, this grand mansion, is just kind of almost manifests out of Sutpen's will, because he and all of the Negroes that he brings from presumably the Caribbean, where we think he's originated as
Yeah.
well. And I think they say the architect is from Martinique. So I think it takes them 3 years to build this structure, this grand mansion.
It takes them, and there's a kind of a time scheme in the second chapter in terms of phases. 2 years to build a house. So that's that begins in 1835, and I made myself some notes here just so I wouldn't get it wrong because it is involved. So when Sutpen arrives in 1833, he's 25 years old, so he's a young man. Um, just to sort of to give some context, Mississippi statehood was 1817. So everything is just this territory was called the Southwest Territory at the time. Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, but Louisiana wasn't part of it yet until 1815 in the Louisiana. Well, it was already by then, wasn't it? Yeah, the Louisiana Purchase. But so then in 1833, he leaves, he disappears for 2 months, and when he comes back, um, he's got those slaves and the French architect, but he's already acquired, and this is the way it's described in the book as 100 square miles of some of the best virgin bottomland in the country. Now that baffled me at the beginning. 100 square miles. Did he mean 100 miles square or 100 square miles? So I did some figuring. I got my calculator out and everything. And as near as I can tell, he bought from Ikematubi, the Chickasaw chief, uh, land that Ikematubi had been given by the federal government, you know, and he got 100 square miles, which equals 64,000 acres.
Wow.
That's a lot. That's a lot, you know. And then on a part of it, then he begins to build that house. And this is it. That begins in 1835. It takes him 2 years to build the house. And then after that, and he doesn't finish it, right? There are no doors, there are no windows in it. And he lives like that with his slaves for 3 years. And he entertains parties of men from the town, and they come out and they do some very dubious things. But it's all very secretive, and the men are not going to tell anything about it or not. Of course not. And then in phase three, it starts in 1838. That's when he begins looking for a wife. That's when he targets Goodhue Coldfield and his daughter Ellen. So that whole process, you know, is 5 years until he gets what he wants, and doesn't tell anybody much of anything. But in addition to Goodhue Coldfield, and this is very important, he has one kind of friend, sort of friend, and that is Mr. Compson's father, General Compson. And so we might say politically, General Compson is equal to Goodhue Coldfield in moral terms, right? General Compson is a war hero who survived the war and come back home. And so he helps Sutpen on a couple of occasions. When he gets arrested, right? How does the town treat Sutpen? He comes in on that one horse, nothing else, then leaves again. He stays at the Holston house, and we have to picture just a little village, not even really much of a town. It's just a kind of a village. He leaves again, comes back, the owner of 100 square miles of virgin territory, and then he leaves again. So how are we to measure the town's reaction to him?
Yeah, well, I think in in my reading, it's incredible. They're incredibly suspicious. First of all, how did he get the money to buy all of this land?
Yes.
Where's he from? Who is he? And then he comes back with this rather, um, after 2 months, I think, with this rather foppish architect that's got these flamboyant clothes that he doesn't take off the entire time he's there, kind of directing the building of the house. And then there's also this group of Negroes that comes, and no one can understand what these Negroes are speaking, because I believe they're speaking some kind of like Haitian Creole or patois or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So Sutpen is able to communicate quite freely with them, but the townspeople have no idea what they're saying to each other. They're all sleeping outside for years at a time while this house is being built. And Sutpen doesn't, I don't know. He seems, other than kind of trying to make these alliances with General Compson and Mr. Coldfield, kind of he doesn't, he's kind of an outsider and doesn't really care to perhaps become a very respectable person in the community.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Right. They just don't know anything about him. And as you know, still, I think it's still this way in the South to a degree. When somebody new moves into the community, the first question is who are their people? Where do they come from? But none of that is known about Sutpen. He's just a total unknown. And there's a wonderful metaphor uh, in chapter 2. And should I call out a page number? But your readers may have page different editions.
Yeah, I think just saying chapter 2 is sufficient.
Yeah, chapter 2. Okay, so I'm going to read this here. Um, this is when the wedding has been planned, right? And nobody's going to come, but he doubtless remembered even better than Mr. Coldfield that 2 months ago he had been in jail. This is Sutpen, right? He's arrested, um, which at some moment during the 5 preceding years had. I'm sorry. Um, that and that a public opinion, which at some moment during the 5 preceding years had swallowed him. Public opinion had swallowed him, even though he never had quite ever lain quiet on its stomach. Think about that as a metaphor, right? The town has swallowed him, but he's not lying quiet on their stomach. Had performed one of mankind's natural and violent and inexplicable volte-faces and regurgitated him. And it did not help him any that at least two of the citizens, Coldfield and General Compson, who should have made two of the teeth in the outraged jaw, served instead as props to hold the jaw open and impotent while he walked out of it unharmed. And that is very typical of the kind of metaphors that Faulkner uses in this thing. It's not simple, right? You have to think it through. But the town has swallowed him without even knowing that it swallowed him. And now that he's not laying quiet on their stomach, it throws him up, you know, through the mouth that is held open by General Compton and Goodhue Coldfield.
Yeah, I just love the imagery of this book. There's also a passage about the the house on Sutpen's Hundred being sentient and kind of having this will of its own as a structure. That's just a really the the phrasing and the imagery. I think it's just uh, electric.
Yeah, it really is. It's not simple. I mean, but it grabs you. And, his first title for this novel was Dark House. And then he came up with the Absalom, and he wrote to his publishers, "I'm changing the title, and this one I like very much." So it's like he'd come into understanding his novel in some way at that point. There's another metaphor that I think is really important to understanding what this book is all about, and that comes in chapter 1, early in the story. Um, some bare facts are laid out. Quentin is described, young Quentin. How old would he be? He's getting ready to go off to Harvard for his freshman year. So that means that he would be 18, 19 years old, something like that. And so he's heard stories all of his life about the South and the Civil War. The most popular critical book that has been published in the last couple of years was under the title The Saddest Words, and by this guy named Michael Gora, and he's writing about Faulkner's dealing with the Civil War and how in this novel, then Mr. Compson says the saddest word is was, because you can't go back and change it. And then later on, um, the second saddest word is again, because as Faulkner was fond of saying, the past is never past. It's always with us and it's always being repeated again. So the two saddest words are was and again. And we hear Quentin at the beginning of this novel lamenting the fact that he's got to hear it all over again but from this perspective, involving Sutpen. And then there's this metaphor. This is on page 7 and 8, so early in the novel. See if I can find it. Okay, so here's Quentin listening. Quentin had grown up with that. The mere names were interchangeable and almost myriad. His childhood was full of them. His very body was an empty hall, echoing with sonorous, defeated names. He was not a being, an entity. He was a commonwealth. He was a barracks filled with he was a barracks filled with stubborn, bat-looking ghosts, still recovering even 43 years afterward from the fever which had cured the disease, waking from the fever without even knowing that it had been the fever itself which they had fought against and not the sickness, looking with stubborn recalcitrance backward beyond the fever and into the disease with actual regret, weak from the fever, yet free of the disease, and not even aware that the freedom was that of impotence. Now that's really involved, but we can begin to see that how it is the template for the entire novel. Because, so we got two words there, fever and disease. What would be the disease in the South? It would be slavery, and the fever would be the war, right? And we know that fever is necessary to cure one of a disease if one survives it, right? So here Quentin is having to live with the consequence of that, not only the disease, which is slavery, but the fever, which is the war itself. And so that's why he feels like he's a barracks filled with back-looking ghosts. And so if we get that, as I say, very early in the novel, if we get that in our imaginations as we read, we understand that, whoa, this whole novel is about not just Sutpen and not just Jefferson, but it's about America. It's about the whole of our nation and its entire history with a memory that it would just as soon forget, but it can't even now. So I think that's always and as you were saying, his images are great, and it's always good to dwell with them and think through them some.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far afield, Larry, but I know that you've deeply read pretty much all of Faulkner. That seems like, from what I know, and I haven't read all of Faulkner yet, but that could almost be the central theme of all of his work. Wouldn't you say
Yes.
this legacy, this fever, this disease, and how the memories of it kind of are scarring people in the present day?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You can see it. Read the New York Times any day of the week, and you see vestiges of that. And it just won't go away. Um, and yeah, I don't know what to do other than live with it and continue to struggle with it.
Yeah.
So you're right.
There are two remarkable scenes that I want us to touch on before we close for today, but one is this horrible, vicious spectacle that Sutpen puts on. I guess occasionally at night at Sutpen's Hundred, where he has the Negroes kind of I wouldn't even call it bare knuckle wrestling. They are gouging each other's eyes out. They are just viciously fighting, almost like you would think about a cockfight or a dog fight or something. And there is this this time, at least, and maybe several times, when it's not two Negroes, but it's Sutpen himself that's in the ring with one of the Negroes, and both of his children are looking on. The son, Henry, he knows is there because he apparently wants him to be there. And Henry is sickened by it and actually, I think, physically throws up. But hidden out of sight is his daughter Judith, and she's kind of unperturbed by what she's seeing.
Yes, yes, that's right. So against our stereotypes, right? What ought to affect girls and what ought to affect boys is kind of reversed. But there's a third one. Judith is, and this takes place in the barn that he's built away from the house, right? And this is after Ellen, of course, has moved in and she's had the babies. So there are windows and doors and formal gardens and all kinds of things like that. But the barn is down away from the house, as you would expect it to be. And so inside this barn, inside these stables, it's not a formal ring, but as you say, it's kind of like, what do they call that? The um, that kind of fighting where there are no holds barred and anything goes and all of
Yeah,
that.
WWF or yeah, some of those things.
Whatever that is. But anyway, so Judith has sneaked up into the loft of that barn and is looking down through the hole, the window. But next to her is somebody else, another little girl, and this is Clytemnestra, Clytie, of Aeschylus fame, in that Oresteia trilogy. And they are both looking down, two girl faces looking down, unperturbed totally by it all. They are both Sutpen's children, both his daughters. And so, what do you say about that? Well, I guess you could say at the beginning that Henry has feelings that we ought to admire, that we would naturally admire, right? He doesn't like to see this kind of violence. But Judith, it ought to disturb us very much that she is not perturbed by it. And then just after this, in that chapter, it turns out that at some point, they have started going to church, not with Sutpen, but Ellen and the two children have started going to church in a phaeton, right, which is a carriage. But that can't even be done normally in a civilized way. It becomes a race, that Judith herself has instigated, right? She wants the race. And so when she sees, let's see, is it the phaeton that replaces the carriage? I guess it is, right? And when she goes out and sees that there's going to be no more races, she gets violently ill and has to go to bed, because this wayward part of her is not going to get satisfied anymore. So this is all Sutpen's doing. This is what he has engendered in them. But then we remember this because we begin to get in these first three chapters some hints and mentions of other characters that are coming up that are going to complicate this whole plot, including this man named Charles Bond, who it turns out, as Mr. Compson knows, but he doesn't know everything. Mr. Compson doesn't know it all. Who, Charles Bond, is actually another son of Sutpen that he got in Haiti, in the Caribbean, when he was there making his money. We don't know any of that yet. you know.
Right, right. I guess I'm struck by your description of the setting for this fight, and it's away from this grand house and these beautiful formal gardens, and it's kind of this struggle, right, between the wild and the savage, which it seems that Sutpen, if he wants some other part of him to predominate, like a civilized or respectability, he's losing that fight because it seems that there's a lot of the wild and savage in him. But he's kind of cloaked himself in all of the accoutrements of respectability if you didn't really know what was going on with him.
Yes, that's a very good way to put it, and it goes a long way toward explaining Sutpen as we see him. And at one point, this is in chapter 2, when Mr. Compson talks about him as being like John L. Sullivan, the great boxer, during that time. Um, and I'm just reading. So Mr. Compton says, yes, he was underbred. Underbred. That's such a Southern thing to say. It showed like this always, your grandfather said, in all his formal contacts with people. He was like John L. Sullivan, having taught himself painfully and tediously to do the Scottish, having drilled himself in secret, until now he believed it no longer necessary to count the music's beat, say. There's another one of those images. He may have believed that your grandfather or Judge Benbow might have done it a little more effortlessly than he, but he would not have believed that anyone could have beat him in knowing what to do, when to do it, and how. And besides, it was in his face. And you quoted this in the blurb you gave us this past week. Anyone could look at him and say, given the occasion and the need, this man can and will do anything.
Yeah.
So this is who he is.
There's another scene that I want to touch on that I found very disturbing, and it's the wedding scene
Oh,
when Sutpen is marrying Ellen, and they invite the whole town of Jefferson, and not only do people not come, but they kind of I had this scene, maybe it's probably from American movies, but like pitchforks and torches and people kind of actively being physically aggressive about the fact that this ceremony is happening inside. And we learn, I think, that maybe General Compson is at the church, or maybe Mr. Coldfield for sure, because he's the father of the bride, and Rosa presumably, but hardly anyone is inside the church. And Ellen is extremely distressed that no one has come to the wedding. Sutpen really doesn't care, and he has to have his Negroes kind of guarding the door and providing them with safe passage, or else there's this hint that maybe some aggression is going to, some fighting or something will happen.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And the thing to note is that remember the aunt, Rosa's aunt, Mr. Coldfield's sister, is still with them. Now she later deserts, runs away with a horse trader, and gets married to him. But at this point, she's there promoting the wedding, and on the morning of the wedding, that's going to be that evening, she goes to every house in Jefferson with an invitation, and as the narrator, Mr. Compson, says, daring them not to come, you know. And so there are 100 invitations that she sends out. That's a lot of invitations for a town this small. And none of them come into the church except Mr. Compson, and who's not General Compson yet, Mr. Compson and his new wife. Other than that, it's just a wedding party. But outside, those invitees are sitting in their carriages and sitting in their buggies. And then ringing the whole scene are these, what are described as drovers, tradespeople, salesmen, and all the riffraff that comes through town, from time to time. They're the ones who have vegetables, refuse, and they throw them at Sutpen, and they knock his hat off. They throw them at Ellen, and so then she begins weeping at all of it. She goes in uh, after marriage, and then this is what happens when she comes out. And so, as Mr. Compson says at the end, it did indeed rain on that marriage. What he means by rain is the tears, her tears. So, yeah, it's quite a striking scene.
Yeah, it certainly is.
But you're right; it affect doesn't affect Sutphen nearly the way it does Ellen, of course. So,
Right. You almost feel Ellen is humiliated, but I get the sense that Sutpen, from the first day that he arrives in Jefferson in 1833 is is used to being humiliated and is definitely seeking his revenge.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I think that's right. Yeah. So, boy, much more remains to be unfolded in the story. It's just beginning. But there's no doubt that, and again, to go back to that sentence that you quoted, it it is that he's just about does anything to get where he wants to be, and we don't yet know where that is. One of the best of Faulkner critics of all time is Cleonth Brooks, and when this novel came out in 1936, it was pretty much blasted for any number of reasons, including the obfuscatory nature of his writing, as one reviewer said. How can you be expected to understand it? Just a very few critics really loved it, and Cleon Brooks was one of them. And later he wrote a whole book called The Yoknapatawpha Country, in which he starts off his essay by saying, Absalom, Absalom, in my opinion, the greatest of all Faulkner novels, is probably the least well understood of all his books. And I can agree with that. Then he says, it is the quality of Sutpen's innocence that we must understand if we are to understand the meaning of his tragedy. And if we confuse it with the innocence as we ordinarily use the term, or even the typical American innocence possessed by, say, and I know you've just done one of Henry James' novels, right? That American innocence possessed by, say, one of Henry James' young heiresses, as she goes to confront the corruption of Europe, we shall remain in the dark. That is, we need to be looking for a new definition of innocence as we read this.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's enough.
Well, Larry, this has been delightful, and I think that you've been kind enough to offer to come back and talk to us again as we slowly make our way through this book. But I don't think we're doing it too slowly because I think that it is the type of book that rewards really careful reading.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah.
And I,
Thank you so much for the invitation.
yes, absolutely. This has been fun, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yes, I'm on. Count
All
me
right,
in.
great.